welcome to this afternoon's event. My name is Maxim Schreier. I'm a professor at Boston College, and I direct the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center at Harvard University. And I'm delighted to be here and to welcome our wonderful speaker, Professor Kirill Pfefferman of Ariel University of Israel. I will introduce him formally in a little while, but before I do that, I would like to thank our sponsors. The project is generously supported by Genesis Philanthropy Group, and it is also supported by the Harvard Center for Jewish Studies and by the Davis Center. And of course, I'm very grateful to all my colleagues here at the Davis Center for the great work they do behind the scenes in making these events happen. And also, I would like to highlight the next and final event of the season. On the 24th of March, 2021, we will have Professor Michael Wachtel of Princeton, who will be speaking about the very interesting topic in battle for the German mind, Yevsei Shor, Rudolf Rössler, and the Vita Nova Publishing House. So we hope to see you on the 24th. And now, without further ado, I'm really thrilled to introduce my very good friend and colleague, a tremendously influential historian of the Shoah in the occupied Soviet territories, Kirill Pfefferman, who was born in Moscow in 1970. So we belong to the same last Brezhnevian Soviet generation, so to speak. In 1991, Pfefferman moved to Israel. In 2008, he earned a PhD in contemporary Jewish history with a specialization in Holocaust history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Pfefferman's expertise entails a variety of topics related to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, contemporary general and Jewish history, centered around two world wars of the 20th century, the history of the Soviet and German totalitarianism, and their attitudes toward Jews. He has published prolifically. Let me just mention his books. His first book, Soviet Jewish Stepchild, The Holocaust in the Soviet Mindset, 1941-1964, was an analysis of the treatment of the Shoah in the USSR, with particular focus on the Babi Yar massacre. Dr. Pfefferman's second book, The Holocaust in the Crimea and the North Caucasus, which has become a classic, was issued by Yad Vashem Publications in 2016. And his most recent book, If We Had Wings, We Would Fly to You, a Soviet Jewish Family Faces Destruction, 1941-42, was published recently by Academic Studies Press here in Boston, and I was very happy to feature it in the book series that I edit for Academic Studies Press. And this wonderful book relates the evacuation of Jews in the Soviet Union during World War II through a study of one family's correspondence, and shows this incredible interaction of factors at the micro and macro levels. As I mentioned before, Dr. Kirill Pfefferman teaches at Ariel University. And Kirill, we're very, very happy to have you and very much looking forward to your talk this afternoon, titled To Flee or Not to Flee, Soviet Jews Face the German Invasion. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Maxim, dear Professor Schreier, for this generous introduction. And I'm very much grateful to the organizers, to Davis Center, and to the sponsors of this event. And it's a great event for me. I haven't traveled anywhere for a year. And now, right now, I travel to Boston, to Harvard. It's a big event. So, and a great opportunity, of course, to share my thoughts on this topic. I would say that the topic you have finished with, that is my last book, certainly constitute a bridge to today's presentation. But it is a bit a larger story, not only one family, but a broader view, so to say. So let me start with the PPP presentation. This is how it all, it's so this is called. I will begin with the broader picture, the government, the regime, the strategy, and then we'll finish with the Jews themselves. So the Soviet government, uh, of course, was thinking about evacuation even prior to the war, and certainly after the beginning of the war. Now, of course, it was also a part of strategy, of the big strategy, how to win the war. Let's put it this way: in 1941, how not to lose war immediately. The strategy that was envisaged was the so-called the scorched war, how to leave nothing to the Germans, and to take, to evacuate, to remove as much as possible. This strategy on paper had its advantages. Of course, the Soviets in this case would keep all their human resources. We are talking here about the evacuation of people, not of industry. The evacuation of industry was, of course, a priority, but we're talking about people. So, but human resources are also a very important asset during the war. It could be an advantage, was probably a decisive advantage. Now. And of course, the Germans would be left with nothing. No people to rule, and no people to who could be forced to walk on this in these vast territories. And definitely an advantage. On the other hand, as every strategy, it could have disadvantages. First of all, it was extremely difficult to carry it out. We're talking about the removal of millions of people within a short times, within a short period of time, sometimes probably very short. Beyond that, even the Soviets from the very beginning, even before the war, they thought about the people's war, partisans' war. Who would engage in this people's war? Only those people who would be parachuted from Moscow, or some local elements. So these people, could have a value in their own right. And of course, by leaving a significant number of people in the occupied territories to be ruled by the Germans, they they let the Germans rule this population. It was now their headache how to rule these people. The frictions between the population and the occupier were inevitable, and it would make sense to capitalize on these frictions in the long run. And of course, the Germans, by the way, they never concealed their plans to Germanize this so-called living space. And by leaving no one in the occupied territories, or the territories due to be occupied, they would, leave, the entire territory for the Germans to Germanize. And of course, it was a disadvantage from the Soviet point of view. It was all on paper. The reality looked a bit different. The German invasion was unexpected. It was a part of the Soviet strategy, but the actual timing and the actual dimensions of this invasion were unexpected. And in terms of depth and speed, the German development advanced too quickly, and definitely took the Soviet command by surprise. To such an extent that after several weeks after the beginning of the war, the regime felt that its own survival was at stake. And definitely under such circumstances, one could hardly carry out this big strategy of removal as much as millions of people. Only people who were deemed absolutely critical for the survival of the regime, flesh of the country, could be ordered to evacuate. And who were these people? Of course, these were people who were close to the regime, on whose allegiance the regime relied. people who were involved in its functioning. Of course, security, party, Soviet, of course, high-ranking people, the evacuation was prioritized. It doesn't mean that every party member could hope to be evacuated by the government. It was not the case. And defense industries, since the removal of defense industries from the due to be occupied territories was an absolute priority, all those who were employed there were also regarded as those whose evacuation was a top priority. But the Soviet regime, the Soviet government, the Bolshevik regime, they always, I would say, knew to create infrastructure for a much bigger project that was initially envisioned. And so it was also the case with the evacuation program. It was initially envisioned for a small, relatively smaller, limited number of people. But in fact, the infrastructure was created within a very short time span for evacuation of many more people. Not included in these first three categories, or two categories. And it was also mentioned in the Soviet orders issued very soon after the beginning of the war. It was in the bureaucratic parlance referred to as all possible human resources. Actually, everyone could be included in this list. But the government did not go into great length to detail whom they meant by these all possible human resources. And much initiative, much room was left for the local authorities who were entrusted with implementing these orders, whom to include or whom not to include. And in addition, I would say somewhat unexpectedly for such a tough regime, there were a specific place, it was mentioned in the evacuation orders, and it was implemented here and there for so-called, for what I call humanitarian cases. They didn't refer to them as humanitarian cases, but in fact, it was today, in today's language, we would call them human or evacuation out of humanitarian reasons. Here is an example: evacuation of the blind people. Look, they all, this is how they were removed. There is no doubt their evacuation, their removal from the occupied territories did not make any strategic sense for the smooth functioning of the Soviet war machine. So the pure humanitarian reasons. But evacuation, we can say, let's say first a couple of words about the evacuation of Jews. How did the government feel about the evacuation of Jews? Did it assign any priority to evacuation of this group? First of all, it should be stated clearly that they were never deemed as necessary. The Jews as a group for the survival of the regime. That is to put it otherwise, individual Jews who were employed in defense industries or who worked for the party, government, or security agencies, they could and were evacuated as a part of this grand evacuation project. But all other Jews, were definitely not regarded as necessary, critically necessary to be evacuated. The Germans, by the way, Nazi propaganda always claimed that the Jews and the Soviets were the same stuff, were the same, and by this famous thesis about Judeo-Bolshevism. But in fact, for the Soviets, from their own point of view, at least insofar as the evacuation program was concerned, have never thought in these terms. What the Jews could hope for in terms of evacuation is to be the next in line, to be evacuated, or I would say to let it, to allow the government to be able to use the facilities created by the government, this evacuation infrastructure. this was the best they could hope for. There were several other categories that could also hope to be evacuated, whose evacuation was never regarded as obligatory. For example, low-ranking members of the Soviet government in the due-to-be-seized territories, and families of the officers of the Red Army. The Germans, by the way, did not conceal that these people would be targeted. Jews, communists, and the families of the officers of the Red Army. So if if the Soviets did read German propaganda leaflets, they drew their conclusions, and these people could hope, to be included in the list of those, of the next on the evacuation list. And so, such being a case, the Jews as a group could hope to be included, to be as in this evacuation program, somewhere between the threatened groups and the humanitarian action, if at all, by the way, of course. We will see how this program played itself out, and whether the Jews were able to avail themselves of these unique opportunities. By the way, we should say that the Soviet Union, despite all its shortcomings, was the only country during the Second World War that created this evacuation program that allowed millions of people to flee the advancing German armies. Of course, the country size was a very important factor here. They had where to flee. But no other country created such a program. So it should be definitely remembered. And now let's see now about these ordinary people who are the main focus of my presentation here, whose evacuation was not ordered, and who were left, who could decide on their own. Of course, we should not exaggerate the degree of their independent decision-making. It was the ensuing decisions dependent heavily on how the relationship between the state, between Moscow, the Kremlin, between local administration, and and ordinary Jews was playing itself out. The central government could demand something. The local administration interpreted these demands, and the local people could avail themselves of these opportunities or could not avail, could not do it. It depended on so many factors. And their personal decisions was definitely not the only factor to be taken into account. The decisions that ordinary Jews were supposed to make were definitely fateful. So much was at stake. Their own life, in retrospect, was at stake. Of course, my primary focus here is those on those who could choose. Not everyone could choose. The crucial factor was, for example, the geography. People who lived close to the border or close to the major routes on which the German armies advanced had didn't have opportunities to make themselves or to avail themselves of this evacuation infrastructure. So it should be emphasized again. Decisions, if people could decided to evacuate, it did not necessarily mean they would be able to implement their decisions. And geography was a extremely important factor here. Another factor is, of course, the information. People didn't know much. Sometimes they didn't know anything about what could evade them under German rule. And what could they know? They could know something from refugees who fled the westernmost Soviet territories, who didn't know anything either, because very few people were actually able to witness what the Germans did. and then cross the front line and say, to offer a first-hand testimony. So it was all circumstantial evidence. Bombardments was another factor that influenced people's decisions. For example, even if people did not, for example, intend to move away, but German bombardments were the important factor that affected mood. So here, by the way, we have a factor that doesn't have anything to do with Jews. Everyone was suffering from bombardments. And by the way, of course, bombardments is a very tricky factor. It doesn't always lead to the land invasion. We have many, for example, examples during the Second World War when there were bombardments and they were not followed by land invasion. So the question how people interpreted it, it's a big question. Everyone interpreted it as he or she wished. And media reports. Here we, for example, we mentioned for the first time I would call it the Soviet factor. What information did the Soviet media produce on German atrocities? Was it underreporting, misreporting, or probably overreporting? And how people, of course, who read it, how they interpreted these reports. An extremely difficult factor for interpretation, because these media reports were skewed, of course, towards presenting a certain picture of German behavior in this total war that began on the 22nd of June, 1941. What could also motivate people to make their decisions were the knowledge they possessed regarding the pre-war events, something they knew or something they heard about as of 1939, and of course, or 41. We will speak about it a bit later. And intuition. Some people simply felt that it was too dangerous to stay there in the occupied, in the due to be or the threatened areas, and decided to move. As a result, a very interesting development was taking place in this country in these fateful months of prior to the German occupation. Soviet people, including Jews, were taught for decades, for 2 pre-war decades, to listen to the government. The government was telling people what to do, what not to do, how, and of course, they were taught to learn, to learn, these signals emanating from the government, because every wrong step could be punished. And here, for the first time, probably sometimes in their entire life, the government didn't tell them anything what to do, with the exception of this small group of people whose evacuation was deemed as mandatory. So all others were not told anything. So it is a degree of freedom, I would say, in a strict totalitarian country, which came at a very crucial timing. For masses of Soviet Jews who were taught by the Soviet state in a very cruel way to be, they were disciplined not to display any initiative, it was a challenge. Some of them were able to meet this challenge, others failed, and others interpreted it in a different way, as we will see soon. So what about this group who decided to flee? Or let's say, which again I would like to emphasize, does not necessarily mean that they were actually able to flee. But what interests me, what I hear most of all, is their decision. I would say I would begin here my discussion with the remark that for decades, Soviet Jews, at least as of the beginning of the Second World War, were regarded as a sort of abnormal Soviet nation, the most Sovietized Soviet people, the most, reliable Soviet nation. And for a variety of reasons, we know more or less all these reasons. The Jews, many Jews were grateful to the Soviet regime for what it did during the interwar period, abolishment of the Pale of Settlement, or uh, unlimited employment or educational opportunities. Probably abolishment of the Pale of Settlement is not a precise term, but definitely people, all limitations of free movement of people were lifted. And the many people, Jews themselves, the government, to Soviet government to some extent, and the Germans, by the way, regarded the Soviet Jews as the super loyal nation. The nation that in the Soviet Union, the nation on which the regime could rely absolutely. And so these people, who decided to flee, or who envisioned this possibility to flee, fit into this category. This is, by the way, you see here the German propaganda poster that identifies Jews with the Soviet regime. This is a full identification. This is why from the Nazi perspective, this war was declared as Jews' war, and Jews were regarded as Bolsheviks, and vice versa. So this group that decided to flee fits into this description, more or less. Their decision-making is more or less well documented because many of them managed to survive and left their memories. What was the profile of this Soviet Jew who decided to flee? He was relatively well placed, well integrated into the Soviet society. As a result, he was more exposed to general sources of information. I would especially emphasize here non-Jewish source of information, because they were living frequently in a non-Jewish society, sometimes outside of the traditional Jewish places of residence. They were very frequent, they were younger, that is, we can say they were brainwashed, or they imbibed Soviet values, and they were more Soviet in very many respects. Because since they were more Soviet, they also trusted Soviet reports on the war and on German atrocities against Jews more than all other Jews, on whom we will talk a bit later. They were also, since they were younger, since they were more Soviet, they thought about their evacuation not only as an escape at any cost, but also as I would say, as a possibility to retain strength in order to be able to fight back later under Soviet rule. And those who were probably did not fit in with this fighting category, they were at least wanted and were ready to wanted to survive in Soviet hinterland. As a rule, at least, this is what my sources tell me. My sources, by the way, I didn't tell it from the very beginning. My sources are overwhelmingly Jewish sources, where sources from the testimonies left by survivors, and those who wrote about those who didn't succeed in evacuating. So evacuation economic factors did not play a significant role in the decisions of these people. Probably they were poorer. Probably simply, since they were more Soviet, these considerations were not significant for them. What about the fear of Germans? A very important factor that led hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews and all other peoples, by the way, to escape. It did exist. Even if they were Soviet, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't fear Germans. But the fact that they were better integrated into Soviet society sometimes provided them with unique information that only government and government officials possessed. Uh, it was something that was not published in media reports, but it was something that army or state or party official knew from their confidential sources. And sometimes they shared it with these well-integrated Jews, which in turn influenced their decision to flee. Uh, I would like now to turn the spotlight on another group, which was somehow forgotten in Holocaust scholarship, those who decided or who opted not to flee. On the face of it, it was the strangest decision people could make. They decided to perish. But of course, this is a wrong assessment of the situation. No one knew at that time that it is what it. This is what evaded them would evade them under German rule. They definitely hoped for something else. And why did they stay? So of course, I am more interested here again in those who decided to make who made their decisions at their own volition, not those who had no choice. Those who who had a choice and decided to stay. So the question is why. Here, those Jews who decided to stay can be described now as a normal Soviet nation. By normal Soviet nation, I mean people, millions of Soviet people pertaining to different nations who had a problem with the Soviet regime or with its pre-war performance, to put it mildly. Many of them suffered personally from the oppressive Soviet policies. Some of them did not suffer it, but personally, by the fed up with these policies. And there was certainly a degree of discontent among very many Soviet people, and Jews in this sense, at least those Jews who opted to stay and not to flee, it turned out to be not so much different from all other Soviet people. They were a normal Soviet nation, so to say. So what was the profile of the average Jew who decided to stay? He was not a communist sympathizer, to put it mildly sometimes, and he was older, sometimes schooled before the Bolshevik Revolution. Quite frequently, he was observant. More or less, we can describe this group. I was thinking about the definition. They were more conservative. And in a number of cases, we know that these people had possessed means. And of course, evacuation was a very costly project. People had to pay for anything. And besides, they had their own fears that the Soviet government, known for its penchant known for its desire to put its hands on people's money, would take their money again. And so these people who decided to stay, and they figured out that probably they would fare better under German rule. And of course, everyone knew it, more or less, or at least everyone sensed that the evacuation that many Jews were talking about was an extremely difficult project. It was extremely difficult, expensive. It was also too dangerous. The fact that you decided to move away, even if you were able to procure all necessary authorizations, does not necessarily mean that you would be able to end up living in Tashkent. This is how evacuation looked like, based on the photographs of the famous Soviet war photographer. It was very frequently, it was the German bombardments was part of the general picture, and trains were bombed, columns of people were bombed, and at every moment these columns could be forestalled by advancing German armies. Absolutely no guarantee that you would be able to escape. And so you see the results of German bombardments. Extremely dangerous enterprise. especially for those whose evacuation was not deemed as critical and in whose evacuation the government did not invest as heavily as in the evacuation of those whose evacuation was absolutely necessary for it. And now, what about the fear of Germans? Did this group fear Germans? Now we can say that Soviet isolationism, that's how I call it, so to say Iron Curtain. Formerly it was not called Iron Curtain, but it was Iron Curtain in the full sense of this war, of this term, even before the war. Was an important factor here. People didn't know much about what Nazi Germany looked like. Of course, Soviet Union did invest heavily in anti-Nazi propaganda from 1933 to 1939. And we cannot say that this critical information was not published, critical information on the Nazi anti-Jewish outbursts was not published in Soviet press. But the question is how ordinary Soviet people, including Jews, interpreted this information. They, in very many cases, at least as far as I can see, did not trust what was published in Soviet newspapers because they got used to seeing it as a propaganda mouthpiece. Is everything else was propaganda? How reports on what the Germans did could be trusted? It makes sense. It doesn't necessarily mean with Soviet isolation. It has to do with the way the regime comported itself and the ways the ordinary people interpreted its behavior. Especially from 1939 until the beginning of the German invasion, that is to say, since the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, when the reports on German misbehavior towards Jews disappeared from Soviet media. And it was also a factor. It does not necessarily mean, again, that all Soviet Jews bought the story that the Nazi anti-Semitism disappeared. There are other sources of information, rumors, but I would say it added one more layer of mistrust for those Soviet Jews who did not trust Soviet reports before 1939. So right now they see this, if the subject disappears entirely, it's one more reason to see it as a propaganda. So this specific group, which was more conservative before the war, viewed Soviet misreporting, underreporting, even overreporting during the war. Of course, it is overreporting. There are so many reports on German atrocities, including those directed against the Jews published in Soviet media, but people simply don't. Many people, not everyone, don't trust them because they got used not to trust in them. So for them, it was simply too much. Even if there were excesses, here and there, German excesses towards Jews, definitely from the Jewish point of view, it was too much. Some of them, the older generation, also remembered good Germans from the First World War, when German occupation definitely brought peace and to pogroms, and definitely, it was for many Russian Jews, it was the only good period during the First World War. All other periods included pogroms, atrocities against the Jews. So it was not easy to accept that the Germans would change their ways that radically. And finally, we should remember that before the beginning of the German invasion, there was no genocide of the Jews. The genocide begins with the beginning of the German invasion. And of course, the Germans did not share this news with anyone else. It was a top secret. So even if some reports on what the Germans are doing towards Jews in the occupied territories start being published in Soviet media, it was a bit too late. It was piecemeal. And of course, if we should add this dimension of mistrust, because it was too much. So basically, there was no hard evidence for these people that the Germans do what they did. And for those who were eager to stay, it was not enough to persuade them to move. Again, we should take into account the geography. People who lived in the western regions occupied annexed by the Soviet Union starting from the beginning of the Second World War, they were probably particularly reluctant to accept Soviet claims about German misbehavior towards Jews. They were less Soviet, more observant, more conservative, richer. And those of them who could choose their own volition frequently were reluctant to move. So in this respect, a very interesting episode that did take place, and it gives us a insight into the thinking of these people, is taking place in 1940, several, months before the beginning of the German invasion, when a significant number of Polish Jews who fled German invasion of Poland and were able to make their way into the Soviet-occupied part of Poland. They faced Soviet rule in Poland, and they were so appalled by what they saw in this Soviet area that they decided on their own volition to get back to German-occupied part of Poland, the so-called General Gouvernement. And we could only imagine, what they saw and what they convinced them to move, and this to move back to the German area. And this is, indicative of the mood that reigned among those more conservative Jews, less Soviet Jews, who decided to stay under German rule. In this sense, we can say that, the two factors that were at play here was fear. Whom do you fear more? Do you fear more the Germans or the Soviets? And the Germans were sort of unknown quality. No one knew exactly what they would do. And the Soviets, everyone more or less understood, what they would be, what they were up to. And to live under German rule, for those, again, I should emphasize it, who decided who opted to stay, was viewed as a lesser of evils, actually. As far as we know, these people contemplated some sort of ghettoization, the things that actually took place in the German-occupied part of Poland, some sort of discrimination, things that did take place in Germany itself during the 1930s. And to be, sort of getting back to the Tsarist rule, and that's all, certainly. We know less about these people because this group was entirely wiped out, and where they left less documents. There was almost no physical presence. They didn't survive, with some exception. But these people did exist. And there were quite a number of them. And again, I should emphasize that, with those, my story is about those who, it doesn't really, it doesn't relate to those who wish to flee. There was also a group of those who wished to flee, but didn't succeed in doing it. But the story is about those who consciously decided to stay. Now, of course, in retrospect, we can say that these people understood very quickly that they made a huge mistake, the biggest mistake probably in their life, and the fact that they contemplated living under German rule before it actually started does not necessarily, or certainly doesn't mean they continue thinking along these lines later on. The Germans convinced them very soon that they made a fatal mistake. But this, a combination of factors, some of them have to do with the peculiar ways of the Soviet regime, like isolationism, propaganda, and some of them have to do with the Jews themselves. brought about this unfortunate result when thousands of people miscalculated and decided to stay and actually ended up being killed during the Holocaust. And this is to the best of my, this is the end of my story. I hope I managed to, to do it within the time assigned.
Thank you so much. Well, perhaps we could close out the screen, and we have a lot of questions. Thank you, Professor Pfefferman, for this illuminating story. And before we turn to the questions, I just want to say that, of course, in hindsight, it is very easy to assume the very thing that you are refusing to assume, which is why I think it's such a wonderful presentation, which is that all Jews living in the occupied Soviet territories would want to flee. In hindsight, because we know the story of the Shoah in the occupied territories. But I think what is so valuable about your presentation is that it shows a degree of nuance in the decision-making process, not just volition, simple, but nuance that I think one is not always prepared to assume. And especially those of us who originally come from the former Soviet Union and have family stories, had families in the former Pale in the western frontiers of the Soviet Union who lived and died during the occupation. And also the second brief observation is that in a sense, the story you tell is complex because Jewish families were torn apart not in two ways, as is easy to assume, but in three ways. In other words, there were those who stayed, chose to stay, couldn't get out, and became part of perhaps over 1.5 million Jews killed in the occupied Soviet territories. Then there were those Jewish men and women who fought in the Red Army and Navy, about 500,000 of them, which is a very large number, and also endured heavy losses. And then finally, those who got out. And I hope we'll get to the question of the numbers, but I think the number of those too is one that we are beginning to reevaluate and rethink. In any case, thank you for that. Let me turn to some questions. We had several questions having to do with the Jewish partisans in the occupied territories, the formation of the partisan units, and how your story relates to that. I was hoping you would shed some light on that.
I would say the partisan movement in the clandestine movement in and around ghettos was organized as a rule by a younger generation, which was more militant, of course, and was of more value to the Soviet partisan movement, of course. Now, after initial hesitations, in many cases, they received at least tacit approval, sometimes more than tacit approval, from the communal leadership. Those people who quickly realized, that it probably could be the only way, or quickly, or not that quickly realized it would be the only way to save at least something. I would say that the partisan movement does not necessarily mean survival. It was a way to leave a mark. To show the Germans that the Jews should be reckoned with, and the survival in the occupied territories was a tricky thing, and in consideration of hostile, sometimes local population, hostility of the local population, hostility of, I would say, indifference of Soviet partisans, let alone all other partisans, so-called nationalist partisans. Um, but it was a way to say something, probably some elements within a younger generation, sometimes this realization came too late. In order to save a significant part of the population. But of course, these people had to take into account the very heavy reprisals the Germans visited on the remaining ghetto inmates. So it was a question, what to opt for. You want to save, let's say, 10 young people, but 100 would be killed. Is a German, they called it retaliation action. And of course, those who still lived in a ghetto, they hoped to survive. The Germans never told them that they would kill anyone. So it was big decisions, life and death decisions.
Very good. Yes, we also, thank you, have a very interesting question from an audience member who is referring to the territories annexed from Poland following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the Jews on these territories who, as the of the person asking the question suggests, were aware of Kristallnacht, were familiar with the Žydų Komuna propaganda. What was their response different from the Soviet Jews who had been living continuously in the Soviet Union since after the Civil War, since after 1921-22, say?
Yes, it's indeed a very important question. I would say, to the best of my understanding, Soviet Jews in the core Soviet territories, at least the younger generation, but not only the younger generation, they somehow got used to thinking that anti-Semitism receded from the picture. And this is, of course, was the major claim of the Soviet government, that anti-Semitism has been done away with, and it only here and only thanks to us. And many people bought it, because indeed there were no overt display of anti-Semitism. It was strictly forbidden. And in this sense, the hostility, or at least indifference, on many people around the local population came to them as a shock. In contrast, Jews who lived in the annexed territories, they were familiar with the idea of Žydų Komuna, and for them the hostility or the hostile neutrality on the part of the local population was something they understood. It didn't come to them as a surprise. And it was probably easier to operate in such an environment. You don't spend time on being surprised.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And one more question relating to that, perhaps, to sort of the expectations of decision-making. The question was about the Jewish agricultural autonomous districts in the south of Russia, in Crimea, and whether there were different decision-making mechanisms there, or different evacuation policies, for that matter.
Well, so this, people generally, people who lived far away from cities, had less information. There was no internet in every part of the Soviet Union, and it was difficult. Not only we are talking not only about major newspapers, and we were already talking about the degree of mistrust probably experienced by some Soviet Jews towards them. But even these newspapers did not always reach these agricultural settlements. Even if they reached, it could reach them weeks or even months after they were published. Now, refugees, another important source of information, did not stop there. So If you don't have refugees, if you don't have newspapers, how can you learn about about what is going on, what was going on? So in paradoxically, sometimes these people were able again to benefit from the Soviet evacuation policies, because the evacuation, of course, was not regarded as critical, but it was very important to remove cattle. And cattle, if people, the cattle should be accompanied. And if we're talking about a Jewish village, a Jewish agricultural settlement, those are Jews who are assigned to accompany cattle. So it was a cruel time, and people could be, human beings could be saved thanks to animals, actually, in the full sense of this word. And sometimes, Jews made, but also, I would say there is another factor, which is peculiar for these close-knitted communities. I would call it group mentality. If one person in a village, in a community, decides to move, it is likely that his decision can influence the decisions of all others, because probably he may know something. In close communities, it works differently. It's not like a city. And sometimes we have examples when the whole Jewish village decides to move because one person has a presentiment. And probably he was assigned to accompany cattle, and other people thought it, they would, it makes sense to join him.
Thank you. Let me turn to some more questions. We have a large audience, and as you can imagine, quite a few questions. And this one is about the fact that the Soviet press extensively covered Kristallnacht in November 1938. And as the person who was asking this question suggests, the coverage included reports from Western news agencies like Reuters. There were also organized protests in Moscow and Leningrad involving leading Soviet cultural figures like Alexei Tolstoy. So would not this coverage be some kind of factor in alerting the Jewish population that about what could well happen under the German occupation?
Definitely, it's if we are thinking about whether the Soviets did not report, on such events, they did report, and but the question is how it was all interpreted by ordinary people. Very many people, to the best of my understanding, viewed all these meetings, all these cultural figures, including those representing the so-called Jewish community, which didn't exist in the Soviet Union, as a fake. It's one fake news. Fake. Everything else is a fake. So why should it be trusted? It's a classical propaganda. People. From what I read, they stop believing in Soviet weather forecast.
Right.
Why should they believe, in what is written about political issues? So in this sense, it was a trap actually, because it was everything else was a propaganda. But in this specific case, I am talking about the Soviet anti-Nazi reports. It was true, but people got used to seeing it as propaganda, and it's trap. And no one could imagine that this time they will tell the truth.
Thank you. No, I think that's a terrible lesson that you are highlighting here about the correlation between the perception of true news being fake news in that context. Thank you. I truly appreciate that clarification. We have a very interesting question about the effect of gender on these decisions. The person asking this question is particularly interested in the degree to which wives of Jewish soldiers drafted tended to stay or to leave.
It's difficult to say, for me at least, about tendencies here. I would say that in a number of cases, so this story does not have much to do with what I have told during my presentation.
Right.
It's a different story. These women remained without the person who provided for their families, because he was enlisted. And now, for them, it was in this respect sometimes easier to live because in a number of cases the you know the and the in number of cases they have had no other source of livelihood uh, left here in the Soviet territory, and they could hope for a better employment possibilities somewhere there in the Soviet hinterland. So in this sense, the evacuation presents itself as an economically driven escape. And it was indeed the case in quite a number of cases when the Germans were still far away. And, no one knew for sure whether they would come or not. But in the meantime, you need to provide for your family. You can't do it here, and you should move. And probably sometimes it was they were encouraged by their husbands, by the way, who were already enlisted and knew something or heard something by virtue of being in contact with the army sources, to move because army had its own sources at its disposal, and sometimes, by the way, the soldiers were exposed to a specific source of information. I would call it those were German leaflets dropped on the Soviet front lines. There was a rule not dropped on civilian areas, and what was written in these leaflets, where it was the Wehrmacht, it was said, is fighting its war not against the Russian people, but against Jews, communists, and all those who are associated with them. All others have nothing to fear. So if a soldier, Jewish soldier, is reading this leaflet or somehow learned about what is written there, it is an important warning. And sometimes they were able to share, they were still able, had time to share this information with their families.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned earlier those Polish Jews who returned to the gubernatoriate. And I think there's a question in connection with that. How often did Jews who had moved east decide that their evacuation had failed and try to return? Perhaps you could tell us something about that, Kirill.
Yes, this phenomenon does take place. But I would say, but it was of course caused by, so to say, natural causes. When these evacuees see that they are forestalled by the advancing German armies, so it is a practical decision because if you are embroiled in fighting, it's a mortal danger. Probably you would be able to survive somewhere in the rear area now under German control. It's a different set of considerations, and I would say it does not necessarily have to do with their being Jews or not. So I would say, so to say, general considerations. So it does take place, and it is a relatively large-scale phenomenon.
Thank you. If I may, I just have, we're sort of beginning to approach the point of no return, but we have a little bit of time left. And I still want to entertain a couple of more questions from the audience. But the question that I'd like to ask, I think you've done incredibly important work on the Shoah in Crimea and the Black Sea coast, North Caucasus. And both you and I have spoken and have touched on the question of the secondary evacuation, which I find tremendously interesting and understudied. In other words, those Jews who, say, had fled from, say, Bessarabia, found themselves in Crimea, then found themselves in Krasnodar. And Krasnodar then falls under the occupation quite late in the game. I was wondering if you could sort of tell us some big picture challenges here of what is at stake and how to understand that sort of secondary and tertiary evacuation.
Wow, what a big question. I would say, in addition to the factors we have listed previously, I would add that new local developments that are taking place in this specific secondary evacuation area are very important. For example, the attitudes of local people. Uh, And paradoxically, if local people are hostile, it is an important push factor. And if local people say, we're happy to see you, and we can host you free of charge in our houses, and here is my bed to sleep on, people tend to stay in such a place, and it is a trap. So more anti-Semitism leads to more survival. Absolutely, it was absolutely crazy world. And and again, hospitable, friendly population is a trap.
In a sense, peculiarly, this oddly correlates with the history of, I think, the exodus of Soviet Jews. In a sense, as you know, the areas where more Jews began to apply for permission to leave initially in the early 70s were not central Soviet cities, but areas further to the western frontiers, further in the former Pale. And I find that a very, very intriguing observation, right? Would you say?
Yeah. Yes. It's a great comparison. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I think several members of the audience have asked questions relating to your new book, and perhaps we could conclude with giving you a chance just to speak a little bit about this project, which I absolutely love, and what the story you're telling in the book is about.
Yeah, it is. So it is a combination of microhistory and macrohistory. You've just heard the macrohistory, in my presentation. The microhistory is about one family that had several members who thought differently. Some of them were more conservative. Some of them were younger. None of them were, by the way, 100% pro-Soviet. And they lived in the city that was situation still far away from the German, from the western border, Rostov-on-Don, and they had time at their disposal to decide, and they decided for the duration of 1 year. Sometimes, some branches of the family decided to stay. Others decided to evacuate, and they correspond with each other, and they try to convince each other. And there is also, I would say, an invisible hand of Soviet censorship at hand. And they all felt it, and so it is a factor to be reckoned with. And so they try to read between the lines, as every Soviet person learned to do. What this meant, what did he hint at? And they even engaged in strategy. They tried to understand what would be the next German move. Incredible thinking, the letters that were, on the face of it, supposed to be vetted by Soviet censors. So all this should be camouflaged somehow as, not on the first page, not on the last page, somewhere in the middle, as, something, that, could not be held against them. But of course they were cautious. Here and there we see proclamations, "Long live Comrade Stalin," and well, the victory will be ours, and so on and so forth. But inside, when you go deeper inside, you see, I would say, more or less free discussion, frequently, not always. And by the way, the closer the Germans are, the more free this discussion becomes. That is the fear of the Soviets recedes. And when the Soviets are back with all their methods, these people again display caution, and this discussion somehow disappears, and then it is back again. So it's the story of one family, unfortunately, the family that decided and thought, was thinking for the duration of 1 year, and it eventually miscalculated what would happen. But it is an incredible story on which today's presentation is built.
Yeah, so by the way, the book, let me feature its title one more time. It's called "If We Had Wings, We Would Fly to You. A Soviet Jewish Family Faces Destruction, 1941, 1942. And perhaps on this note, we will conclude today's presentation. Thank Professor Kirill Pfefferman for having enlightened us. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us, and I hope to see you on the 24th of March for our final event of the season. Thank you. Stay well, stay healthy. Kirill, огромное спасибо.
Спасибо тебе, Maxim. Thanks a lot. Thank you, for launching this event.
Thank you so much.
Very much appreciated.
Bye-bye.